at this point was really the lowest part. I was at this point detached from everything. I remember tenting a house was one of the biggest triggers for me because I felt that the stuff that they used to tent was going to contaminate all my stuff, and I would breathe it in and I would die. I would get different issues with my lungs and stuff. So when I found out my mom had tented her house, now her house was off limits. But then my landlord conveniently waited till we moved in to need to tent. Because she was moving and we were renting her house, and so she waited till we were there and we're gonna have to tent the house. So once again, my brain said, you have to get out, you have to get out. So I actually reached out to my dad, who I hadn't spoken to in about 7 or 8 years because he was very abusive, and I actually asked to live with him. And that blows my mind now because I had an amazing mom. Why would I pick living with somebody who used to be verbally and somewhat physically abusive? Plus he was living with my grandma and my my sister was like 10. I mean, why would I want to live with a 10-year-old, a 70-year-old, and an abusive father? But that was so much more important to me because their house wasn't tented than moving with my mom and I had nowhere to go. So that day of moving was some of the hardest times in my life with the OCD. I mean, just seeing people touching my stuff and moving it into a truck. And the house, I would go to the house for Christmas, but really going there and inspecting the house and finding all these things wrong. And one of the biggest problems I found was the washer and dryer was old and it wasn't going to be able to clean my stuff well enough. And at this point, I'd run out of money to buy new things. So I absolutely needed a new washer and dryer in there. And luckily, I had bought a new washer and dryer because, I bought it with my money. So I wanted them to put in a new washer and dryer. Well, the only person that was going to do that was my dad because the moving people weren't contracted to do it and they were done. We had already moved our stuff. And so I was begging my dad at 10 at night, you have to hook up this washer and dryer tonight. You have to move the other one out. And he's like, I can't by myself 3 flights up and down stairs. But I begged so hard that he finally agreed. And he just blew up on me and was yelling, and it really reminded me of my childhood. It was just bad news. And I headed back to my house and packed the last stuff. And I remember having seen the movie The Client by John Grisham a couple weeks before, and in the opening scene, the guy plugs his exhaust pipe and commits suicide by running his car. And I just started thinking about that, and it was for the first time in a couple years I felt some sense of peace and happiness, and I was really like, you know what, I can't do this anymore, and this is really a solution now. I didn't feel like anybody cared or loved for me, so I was like, why not? So I pulled my car into the driveway and just started running my car. And I remember getting out once and just walking into the house, and my brain went straight to the OCD. Well, now your exhaust pipe is contaminating all your stuff in the car, and now you're going to have to get rid of it, and you don't have money to buy new stuff. So my brain was just traveling, and I remember just getting in my car and laying back the seat and preparing to die. And this is kind of hard to talk about, how many times I practiced. I don't think you can ever explain to someone unless they've tried it what it's like to attempt suicide. I mean, really to get to that point where you're so low in your life that you absolutely have no will to go on. I was so disconnected from reality, and I was so tired, and I was so isolated that was the only solution. I remember being at peace. I was really at peace and was okay with it if it happened. There was no part of me that was feeling regrets and stuff. And the only reason I'm talking to you today is my roommate, who I swear she never missed work. She was the kind of person, she would be dead sick, but she always worked. For some reason came home from work because she was sick. And she heard me in the car and running in the garage, and she came in and she opened the door and she's like, what the hell is going on? And I lied to her and told her that I was moving stuff and fell asleep in the car because it was so late. And she didn't buy it, and I remember her, I think, saying something to my dad or something, and he kind of brushing it off. But I was so mad at her because as soon as I got back in my car and people were waiting for me to drive back to my new place, I was sitting there contemplating all the things that I was now going to have to do. And that was really my rock bottom. I mean, I could not go lower than that. Trying to kill myself again would have been the closest to it, but at that point I was really just a skeleton. I was completely checked out from life.
And I think something that I'm asked most often is, how did I get Chris to go to treatment after this? How did I get him to go? And I always say, I'm so sorry I don't have an answer, because Chris decided to go to treatment. He agreed to go to treatment. And what we've realized over talking with each other is that he had to hit rock bottom. And it's a very common thing for people to say, you've just got to let somebody hit rock bottom and then they'll be ready. Chris had turned out okay. I'm glad I wasn't there to see him because I would have cushioned that fall. I would never have let him, as a mom, hit rock bottom, and maybe he wouldn't have gone to therapy. Maybe he would have been sick a couple of years longer, but it's not something that I can live with. And the fact that my son was in a garage doing that and I'm at home totally oblivious is really very difficult to come to terms with, but fortunately it didn't work and he decided to come and get help and show up and ask for help.
I think the reason that I needed help is because that's when I really knew something was wrong. A couple weeks before attempting suicide, I was at a grocery store at good old 3 in the morning, and they don't have cashiers just sitting there waiting for you. They're in the back stocking things, trying to avoid the drunks that come in at 3 in the morning trying to buy alcohol. And so while I was waiting for them to come forward, I was reading this teen magazine, the 17 magazine, which that's the hardest part of the speech, admitting that I was reading 17 magazines. Please don't tell anybody, but I was reading 17 magazine, and there was this little article about OCD. You could have OCD if you have one of these 3 things. And I remember that being the first time thinking, wait a second, they're saying it's a disease. Maybe I have this thing. And I reached out to my mom and my sister, and both of them were like, oh no, I mean, we saw the good, what's that? As good as it gets. I mean, you're not like Jack Nicholson. So I thought, okay, this is really me. So after that, I really reached out to my mom and was like, look, I really think I have this OCD thing. There's something wrong. I knew there was something wrong after attempting suicide. I no longer could pretend that it was reality. My first motivation, like my mom said, I think sometimes she gives me more credit. I wasn't really at that point where I was like, I am so ready for treatment, who cares about Disneyland? Like, treatment is where I want to be. Like, I was not gung-ho, but at this point, I was so checked out that I thought when I told my mom, I kept calling her and I was like, I need to tell you something. And when I thought I was going to tell her about having to, about attempting suicide, I thought she was going to say something like, I'm going to have to take a day off of work for your funeral, and I'm going to have to order food, and you're just a bother. I mean, it really never occurred to me that it would affect her. So when I was I'll always remember this moment, when I was in the dining room with her and telling her, and my mom's a very strong woman, and I've never seen her cry about that many times in my life, and I remember her just, breaking down. And at that point in my life, I decided, whatever you're going to do, Chris, you can't kill yourself. You can't do this to your mom. It really will affect her harder. It's always hard to talk about from her, but it's going to affect her much more than this OCD is, and you can't do that to her. So it was hard. I woke up every day thinking, how am I going to do this? I don't want to be here, but I can't hurt my mom, and I was just in this state. And so luckily my mom was the type of mom that was very active and started doing research and jumped in and would call me, you're going to this therapist, you're going to this appointment, I'm picking you up. And I think that's really what I needed at that time, because without her I wouldn't have gotten help. But because she was so on me, she's queen of nagging, so because she was on me like that, I was able to get to it.
That was one of the nicest things he called me when I was My role in the beginning was exactly that. I accepted his diagnosis. There was no question about it. It was very clear once I understood. I accepted that it was a very severe illness, which sounds really easy, but there are times that parents don't accept that. But it was a severe illness. It was debilitating. Started an education process, looking for doctors, the IOCD Foundation, going online, getting the information that I needed. And what happened is that I reverted back to mommy stage, and he became like a toddler again. He couldn't drive. He couldn't go to school. He had to quit work. He ended up having a terrible panic attack in the parking lot one day, and I went and picked him up, and I had to go in and quit work for him. And he certainly couldn't apply to anything. We tried for disability, which he did not get, but he could not possibly fill out any paperwork or anything like that. Took him to all his appointments, made all the appointments, picked him up at times. He even had times where people were cutting his food for him so that he would eat. It really was like he was a 2-year-old all over again. And at this time, he was calling constantly, all through the day and night. And he would call in the middle of the night to tell me, I'm somewhere, I don't know where, but I've got to vacuum my car. And I had no idea where he was, what he was doing. Yeah, there's some weird people over there, but I don't care, I have to vacuum my car. There were times he told me he'd leave the keys in the car and go someplace to do something. He didn't care if they stole his car because he had to go clean something at that point. So he would talk to me about what was going on, and that was when I first got to see inside the OCD mind, which is a very scary, scary place. Very circular, rambling speech, just on and on. He gave the example of, I pour my Tide, the vapors from the dirty clothes fill the bottle's contaminated. It would go on. Well, if I put the bottle down in the washer, it's contaminated. Now I have to clean the washer, but the sponge, I used it somewhere, so now I have to get a new sponge. His grandmother would pick out $90 shoes from the trash can. He just threw them away. Whatever his brain told him, that's what he had to do. And it certainly affected us as a family. I'm very thankful that his sister at the time was away at college because I could not have given anything to her. I had no energy left. It was a 24-hour job, just making sure Chris was safe. And really I thought, oh my gosh, this is my new reality. I have a toddler again. You know, here's this grown-up boy and he's like a 2-year-old, and is this going to go on forever? Is he ever going to be able to function again? It would have been great to know that he was, but even a therapist couldn't have, you know, told me exactly where he would have ended up. But, you know, I do tell people, yeah, it'll get better, it'll get better. But in the beginning, it was as if I had a 2-year-old all over again.
And this is where therapy really began. So the first thing we tried to do was go through my insurance, which is always fun, to find, you know, to find somebody that had specialized in OCD and also did medication for OCD. And I think we spent days calling everybody in insurance and in our insurance, and you get voicemails because doctors will refuse to answer their phones. So you leave a voicemail, and we got no call. We got like 4 calls back, and we finally got a call back from a doctor that said he treats OCD and a meds doctor that he knows. Well, the doctor and I met a couple times, and he told my family that I was the worst case he had ever seen, and it was going to take about 4 years just to even start to scratch the surface, and I would be living with them for the rest of my life, and I would never work, and I would never get married, and I would never leave the house, and I'd basically be a grown baby for the rest of my life. So, as you can imagine, I left that meeting really happy and excited about life, and I think that's the best way to deal with people. So, I was like, no, we need to not go back. Luckily, my mom, like I said, was very, very persistent and found the International OCD Foundation actually online. And we found an OCD specialist up in LA. And so I started seeing her name was Karen Pickett, and right off the bat, I felt comfortable with her. She picked the perfect role for me. She wasn't somebody that would let me walk all over her and get away with things, but she also wasn't like a Simon Cowell where, you know, I walk in and she's like, yo, horrible, get out of here. You know, it's like she was able to find that, and that was my Simon Cowell voice apparently, but she was able to find that balance where I would listen to her, and the therapist really, it began. She could also see that there were some other issues, and she suggested a BDD support group. And what's sad is, but good for me at the same time, is everybody had BDD, but we never just have one disease. We always have to have like a couple. I guess you get a discount or something, but everybody else in the room had OCD and anxiety and depression. So being around a group of people that could understand what I was going through, and some people that could tell me I was going to get better, was amazing. I loved going to the group. I trusted my therapist, and the first thing that we did was create a hierarchy of all of my different rituals. So I think she expected me to come in with like a two-piece paper the first day, but I came in with like War and Peace, and I was like carrying this big list and dropped it down. But she sat with me and we went through it, and we labeled everything from a 1, which was a little anxiety, to a 10, where I would rather die than you actually have me do these things. And we started to pick those apart. We also brought in the family, and I think that family was so important because everybody that I was living with, my dad, my grandma, my little sister, brought them in to get them on board, brought in my mom and my sister to get on board, and getting them on the same team and the same page was important. And then lastly, like my mom said, I was calling for reassurance 20 times a minute, constantly. I just drove by this, is that okay? Do I need to go watch something? Do I need to go to the hospital? And that would alleviate my anxiety, which she would answer me, and you know, quickly, you know, my therapist said that has to cut out.
Yeah, I got the enabling speech right away from Karen, and it was very good. And of course, the speech involved Chris, because Chris had to agree to it. If I was not going to offer reassurance, he had to know what I was doing. Because one of the things that happens is that the person gets very angry at you and gets mad that you're not giving the reassurance. But he had agreed that we would not do that. And so it became very easy at that point. relatively easy, to say, I can't answer that, Chris. Remember what Karen said? I can't answer that. And he'd say, ugh. He tried the question 3 other ways, and then, you know, we'd get to, no, I'm not going to answer that. And that really cut it down, but it gave me, you know, the permission to do that, and he knew what I was doing. The other thing that I know worked very well is Chris gave me 100% access to all his medical records and to anything that was going on. Now, that doesn't mean I sat and read his medical records, but there was no break in between. If Karen needed to talk to me about something, she could. She had his permission. Every time we left, I was therapy, and he'd tell me what was going on. I think this was so important that it kept us completely connected at all times, where he was, what he was doing, what he needed from me, and what he was going to be working on. And I appreciate that we did that, and it worked very well, because I think it's very scary. Your kid turns 18 and suddenly you have no access to anything other than writing checks. They always take your check with your name on it, but they won't answer any questions, and yet you're supposed to be helping him, and it's very scary. You don't know what's going on. So that really helped us work together.